Okay, so I just wanted to start with a real brief recap of last week's meeting. I want to compliment everyone who attended and the feedback we got. It was actually great. We got through a lot of really dense material in a 2-hour meeting, and so I wanted to ensure that this Q&A, question and answer, would allow for additional questions, especially any of the nitty gritty around the community guidelines as proposed. Again, this isn't a decision-making point. These drafts will go in front of the BOCC and then to the City Council, and then probably back to the BOCC for both to finally adopt. And ultimately, there's a high likelihood that there'll be a secondary board that will administer these and make future recommendations to revisions. Again, this is a living document intended to be revised as community conditions on the ground change. So we got to start somewhere. So I wanted to just make sure this is an important slide about where we're going and what we're doing. There's really two goals. The first goal in the first 3 months of all of this is to create a foundation on which the future affordable housing program in Lake County and the city of Leadville will live on. And there are two kind of pillars that are quintessential to the practice of affordable housing at a local governance structure. First is the creation of community guidelines, and we'll get into what those are, and the deed restrictions that are actually the legally recorded document against property that protects the investments and subsidies in perpetuity. The second is the governance structure of a future board. Obviously, we have two municipal governments that are working collaboratively to bring affordable housing, and having a body of elected officials and local representatives to serve on that potential board is going to be instrumental to the success of the organization, and allow for oversight and things like grievances, appeals, help guide what kind of housing programs that we can offer outside of actually the development of housing, and then also the development of housing. And one of the big kind of legal loopholes that we need to figure out is how we utilize local government land assets potentially for new housing projects, and whether or not this new board could be the legal mechanism in which property could be transferred and developed via this new board. So that is really the first kind of two meetings, and meeting 3 will kind of wrap a bow around it. In the guidelines, there are lots of references to this body blank in the current draft that came out of the Housing Coalition. So really, it was kind of a chicken and egg to start with guidelines or start with a board formation, but we chose guidelines first. And then again, we'll be getting into the nitty gritty around the board and getting some policy direction from the electeds on April 21st at 6 p.m. at the CMC cafeteria room behind the cafeteria. Goal 2 is where are we headed with all of this, and there is a DOLA grant that will be offered, very competitive this fall. The DOLA funding is up to $1 million for a potential actual affordable housing project. It also covers things like horizontal infrastructure, which is kind of a first for DOLA through this program. And so we are going through a secondary process in which we're looking at 3 sites and the potential, all of which are controlled by local governments or special districts like the school district, and how we can potentially develop those for future affordable housing and actually create a pipeline for future projects into the future. Those charrettes are upcoming too. Jackie, I might call on you here later because I don't have my calendar. I can't pull my calendar up as well, but at the end of the meeting, we can remind everybody when those 2 meeting dates are upcoming. I think it's the 28th, April 28th and May 25th, but I might be mistaken there. So we'll make sure to do that. The final piece of this is looking at potential code changes that would incentivize affordable housing. That is really what DOLA is looking for in this planning effort. And as we go through this process, we will potentially be taking some ideas back to the Planning and Zoning Commission at the city and at the county, and ultimately to elected officials in ways that we can incentivize the private development around the county to actually potentially provide some additional affordable housing assets to our community. So just a recap of what we discussed last time. We talked about who would qualify for future housing. We talked about appreciation caps and resale procedures. We talked about the lotteries. We've kind of touched on rental procedures. And then again, getting into the final thing and pushing on to the 21st is really who's the administrating body. Obviously, Jackie being hired on as a housing director will be kind of the staff, but who gets to appeal a decision in the event that Jackie says you don't qualify, but we have a board that could listen to your grievance. So real quick run through what are in the guidelines. They set the standards for future housing projects. They are flexible. They determine who qualifies. They set rental policies out in the event that there is a rental project. Lottery process is probably the most instrumental piece of this. It outlines permitted capital improvements and appreciation caps on what someone can get. If it's a for sale product that they buy into, certainly we want them to build equity. Homeownership is a major way to build assets in life, so we want to make sure that happens. And how do they resell that? We want to ensure that it's a fair process. A lot of this is best practice and governed by fair housing laws. But there are some things that allow us to prioritize and make community-based decisions on that. But again, it's meant to be inclusive. I want to make sure everyone understands, again, this isn't going to be adopted by ordinance. This is not law or code. Again, it's a guideline. There are different ways that these guidelines are used. There's sometimes we use the whole guidelines and everything. Other times we use sections of the guidelines. For instance, if we have a private developer who comes in and wants to build a project and wants to include affordable housing units as part of their overall development structure, that the lottery system, for instance, could be utilized, and the new administrating body could be asked to conduct a lottery. It's certainly whenever we have a public-private partnership, and those are often seen when we leverage land assets from the public sector, or there's some other types of subsidies that are put in from the public sector into that. And finally, as people live in their homes and move on, hopefully into free market homes, also the resales of property. Deed restrictions are much different. They are the legal instrument. They are recorded on the property to ensure the long-term affordability. They actually can be written to be as strict or as lenient as possible. So strict have appreciation caps, have who qualifies, AMI restrictions, residency restrictions, years in the valley I've seen. And lenient ones could be that it just has to be a primary residence or owner occupied or a long-term rental to someone who's employed in the county. So that normally is based on the amount of subsidy that is put into the project by the local governments. And normally the funder, so for instance, if the state or the feds are involved in like a LIHTC deal, they actually have their own deed restrictions. So it's normally dictated and coming from the major funder in the project to protect affordability. And that's really important as we go forward, because it is a legal document. It's not something that a consultant like myself who doesn't have a law degree should be writing deed restrictions for the county. That'll be coming out of legal counsel. And also, not only does legal have an input on it, often most best practices also involve going to your local lenders to ensure that they'll lend on those deed restrictions to make sure people are successful in getting into this housing. All right, so the important feedback, and I commend the group from the last meeting for really diving into some of the really hard policy discussions. And we got through and got some additional really great feedback, especially on the tiers that I want to present tonight and should spur a little bit of discussion. But so we'll get to the tiers last here in a little bit. But some things that I think were pretty firm direction that we heard is there is a desire to see the lottery be weighted for longevity in the valley. And additional picks for folks that have lived in the community for multiple years, as they have shown years of investment. It sounded like in general there was a consensus on a 2% appreciation cap to start with. That we kind of debated at 2%, 3%. We talked about the difficulties with AMI or consumer price index. And I think for the short term, we're going to go with in the draft a 2% recommendation. And certainly that is a point that will be discussed as this goes through the city council and board of county commissioners. I think there was overwhelming consensus that any resales should require a lottery and that the person shouldn't be able to just sell to their best friend. I think that's best practice. And so that's great. One of the key things that I think was discussed and where we settled on essential workers was that in the tiers that they don't be their own category, and instead looking at how to incentivize essential service providers and employers like the county, the school district, the water, wastewaters, the early childhood givers, the hospital district, et cetera, was to incentivize by giving 2 additional lottery picks to those employees that are employed by those employers. And then the last thing we really didn't get into that I want to touch on tonight is just the permitted capital improvements list that I want to make sure everyone has eyes on. Again, that one is based on best practice. Again, this is just showing the difference in the 2% versus 3% over a 5, 10, 15, and 20 year. And again, the consensus was 2% for now. Again, that can be revisited and often is incorporated into the final deed restriction on the property. Again, looking at the lottery chances, looking at weighting folks who have longevity in the valley. So looking at the number of chances, there was some kind of back and forth on whether or not the last one to award a certified, someone who takes a certified home buyer class an additional pick. There were some comments that that's often required by lenders. I totally understand that, but also I will say that sometimes when the housing authority and Jackie doesn't even have a project going on, she could offer a class. And that class often is an impetus to somebody actually being able to go out and purchase a home in the free market. Even I've actually seen that a lot in Crested Butte. When I did this, I would teach a class and folks would realize after going through the class that they were actually able to potentially afford a unit that they originally didn't think they were, or they motivated them to save up additional money for their down payment and move into the free market. Again, that is a decision. I'm not for or against that in one way, but I have seen different groups do that. It does incentivize folks to actually take the time to, and it's normally a weekend, to go sit and really understand their finances before making a big purchase like a home. Permitted capital improvements, and I think this one is really important to just make sure everyone understands. You know, the one that on this list that I think is always kind of is the tough one is modifications is the last one on the permitted capital improvements. Modifications or improvements to increase energy efficiency or water conservation on a case-by-case basis. Again, this is where it gets sticky, where the housing director gets to make a decision. So what we do see is things like solar panels or like a super high efficiency furnace being put into a unit that has some additional costs. Often those assets, for instance, like a high efficiency furnace, the housing director in that case could have the ability to say, well, here's the normal price of a furnace, here's the high efficiency furnace, you get the value of the increase that it costs you to put in the high efficiency. Again, I've seen it go both ways. That's kind of really the only fuzz in this one. Things that are obvious, like steam showers, jacuzzis, decorative stuff, and the replacement and maintenance of things like appliances if they break. Again, those appliances are typically provided on the first sale, so they should be there for a resale, right? The final one, and this is where I'm going to be opening up the questions now. These are the different tiers, and we got some input from, we did a housing update to the city council. We got basically these 3 options that have kind of emerged as the leading ones. Number 1 really kind of is a simplified version where it starts with individuals Well, first, it starts with this first right of refusal, and I'll be clear on that. What that does is what that tier one is if a developer or an entity brings an asset to the table, i.e., say the school district brings a large parcel and they say the first tier is going to be of the 10 units, we want to set aside 4 units in tier one for school district employees only. And if there's any leftover, then those can go into additional lottery. But since we're providing land, we have an expectation that we get certain number of units. Or it could be a business that comes in and says, we have a land asset. We want to work with the county housing authority, the city housing authority on the development of this property. But we want to ensure that we potentially get 2 or 3 units for our employees, or 2 or 3 units go to our employees. So that's a way to incentivize, and it's an important incentive to include in this to make sure that we're trying to work with the private sector to bring assets to the table. So the first one is kind of a real simplified one. It is basically the first tier are folks who work in Lake County and reside in Lake County, and the second are the ones that potentially commute out. We got some feedback on that, and so I think what you're seeing in the second one is adding a little bit of additional language to longevity. And so if someone has been in the Valley for more than 4 years, they would get bumped up into a tier as part of this pick, and also additional lottery picks. And then the final tier was kind of a compromise that I see from the proposed number 2, and basically allowing any Lake County based employee making up to 200% AMI to be in basically tier 2, and then dropping those commuters into tier 3 and tier 4. What I will say about that is I have my own personal opinions about AMI, but the one thing that I think is a compromise on this far right one is that it allows, for instance, a business that pays a little bit higher wage that has local employees, not disqualify them from doing something like that. Or where it really comes into play is when you have a 2 household income, because the AMI doesn't, I think the 100% AMI in Lake County is somewhere like around 54,000. I would need to check that, but it doesn't jump to 108 for a 2-person income. It actually jumps up like 68,000 or 70,000. And so keep in mind that AMIs sometimes don't accurately reflect a 2-person household, especially when you start adding children in and all of those for those wage earners. So I just want to make sure that we keep that in mind. But I think all 3 of these are great considerations for the council and the BOCC to start thinking about. I am not passionate. This is your community guidelines. I'm not passionate about one of these or the others. So with that, just last quick reminder, again, we're having our follow-up meeting, or the next one on the Regional Housing Authority on April 21st. So with that, I will be quiet and open up for questions.
Yeah, Mike, I've got a question.
Sure.
This is Reed from the Chaffey Housing Trust. Where did the 200% AMI come in?
The 200% AMI is something, again, from the neighboring communities that these guidelines were taken from.
But that has not been presented up until now. So I'm just wondering, what was the interjection of that since the meeting the other night?
I think where that comes into play is that there are employees in both the county and city organizations that they kind of upper level department heads that are in those AMI categories. And so I think there's a desire to make sure that those department head employees wouldn't be excluded from a housing project. What I will say, Reed, is as you know, a lot of if the project is funded through outside money, like a state grant, for instance, like the House Bill 1271 program, their AMI cap's 140, and their rental cap is 80. So certainly it can always be reduced because of an outside funder coming in and saying, hey, that 200% doesn't apply to us. But this would, you keep in mind that these guidelines are, when they're fully applied, would probably be applied to a county or a city property being developed, right? So I think there's a desire at the school district, the county, and the city to ensure that department heads wouldn't be excluded, and that we're inclusive of all of their employees. So that's where the 200% comes from. Make sense?
I understand that there's the desire to reach those higher incomes. I would first like to see, and I can try and dig them up here, what 200% AMI is, but also, and what those jobs look like. But I was just curious as to who brought that to the table, because it had not been presented up until today, from what I see.
I think it was presented at the last meeting. I might have breezed over it, but I can pull up if you give me one.
We also had, Michael, some employers express concern about their employees not going, 40% of them feeling household insecure, but not being eligible to meet and under 120% AMI.
Yeah, this is Greg. Yeah, I think we have, there's certainly plenty of opportunity for lower income people, but we have a lot of people, hospital employees might be a classic example, who need housing, but they may not qualify if we have the AMI too low. That was discussed at the previous meeting. And it kind of surprised me, but then I realized that's actually a pretty good idea.
And again, the guidelines only set a limit, right? Certainly additional funding coming from it, for instance, the DOLA grant. If we were to be successful in the DOLA grant project, they would cap the AMIs on 140 if we use their money for the project for homeownership. So there's always the ability to ratchet it down, but this sets the maximum cap. And again, I'm not wed to that in any way, but I do think like Mayor Lobby just said, I think there are employers in the Valley, especially ones that have potential land assets that would fall into these guidelines, that have employees that are in those upper echelons. Also, I think when you start looking at a 2-person household, this is where it gets really sticky, right? When you have 2 people that have full-time paying jobs, that's really where it doesn't increase exponentially from 1 to 2 people, right? So
Michael, I have a question about the range. I think that's really helpful to pull that up. Like if we have to wait for the engineering assessment and infrastructure, one, to figure out costs, and then applying for $1 million in DOLA support, but that could be 1 million of 6 that's necessary potentially to get infrastructure to any of these sites. So the county and the city are going to have to come up with, in theory, the other 5. So we're putting money in for the infrastructure. Then we're going to have to wait to put out an RFP or an RFQ to a developer and give us costs of that development, right?
yeah, and I think each situation is going to be a little different, right? But yeah, I mean, there's the for instance, like I think when the $5 or $6 million site, that would be potentially the Climax site, right? That has that we're looking at, that has quite a bit of infrastructure need because it's vacant land and it's a larger site. And so yeah, you're right. It's going to be important when we take that money to look at what pieces of property are actually subject to the potential deed restriction, and what our potential projects could be leveraged outside of those funds. Is that where you're going?
I think so, but I'm trying to do the math of city county investment or partner investment, I guess, depending on which property, right? If it's school district property, potentially, what's their investment, and then what's our local government investment potentially, and how do we justify that? So we have likely some gap in this first phase of infrastructure. And then we put out an RFP, we get cost estimates, and then, if we want to serve and house people that hit 100% AMI, what did your graph say? Like $190,000 mortgage,
Sure.
maybe? And so say between 100 and 200 AMI.
This is gonna get real small on everybody. I apologize, but it's the only way to see both. The very bottom is our sales prices versus,
100,
so 100% AMI.
okay, 200. Okay, so we're hoping that the construction price matches with this.
Yep.
This,
And I think Sarah said, I think I know where you're kind of going with your question. What a lot of times when you look at trying to make the pro forma of a project work, what winds up happening is that, and we did this in the largest build I did in Crestview was 25 units at one time. And we had to create units that we actually made two scales. We did in this particular project, we actually did a cap of 120 for certain units, and then we did a cap at 200. What happened was the 200% AMI units that were in these upper like 375, 420 price range for like a 2 versus a 3-bedroom, we added additional costs in the construction costs into those units and then passed the savings on to the 120 units to buy down their costs. So we would add.
Can you say that one more time?
Sure. So
Sorry.
So say in that project, just for real easy numbers, say our average home price was $350,000 for a 3-bedroom. What we did was we increased several of the units to 400, so that added $50,000 extra, and then we were able to discount 2 units by 100,000 to get them at 250. So those units that we discounted at 250 is where we really in that pro forma made sure that those were the kind of the really protected units to make sure that those were 120% and that the folks who qualified truly met those income categories. And we also did it with the 200%, obviously. But that's when you really get into the nitty gritty of actually putting together the complexities of those bigger capital stacks. That's how you're able to shift some of the units from certain AMIs to others. And again, that kind of just gets into that, how you start to pick and choose the tiers. And you actually, at that point, for instance, in that particular project, we literally got rid of all of our tiers and we adopted our own tiered policy for that particular lottery. But then we used the rest of the guidelines, right? After the initial sale. And we used the rest of the guidelines as it related to lottery, resales, everything else on those units moving forward. Does that make sense? That's a lot.
Yeah, I think it makes sense, and I think I get it. I just don't. I think we can make incremental steps of decisions and understand the pro forma only as we go through this process, almost, right?
Yeah, well, it's not as we go through this process, it's as we go through a process to develop property, right? So when we get real projects on the ground, it's going to be heavily dependent on what kind of funding is brought to the table. For instance, if we got the DOLA money to do a project, they're going to say no home ownership over 140 in the whole project, right? So we might not be able to do a $5 million project because there's super big gaps. But again, as we start looking at how to pull together those projects, that's where you really kind of who qualifies, et cetera, starts. What I will say is just one important piece of this is the next meeting, when we start talking about the board, what's really important about that board is there's a potential that we would create a development committee that would bring these kind of complex proposals together for pro forma for the elected officials to consider. And there's definitely, as you can already gather, there's a lot of technical things that go into those final pricing because of just the world of construction. So,
Right.
Lake County Build a Generation. Sorry, did you have any more questions?
I'll follow up. Thanks.
Okay.
I just wanted to flag also that DOH hasn't raised their income limits for the rest of their program. The 140 so far is just for this incentive grant. And I asked Chris Furlong about this when we were at a summit last week, and he said he does not anticipate a change to all of their projects going up to 140. So I think we need to kind of keep in mind that as of now, if there's any funding from the state going in as subsidies, it's probably going to be more realistic at the 120 range.
And that's true. And again, when you, I'm going to stop share here just so I can see some hand raising. When you look at Chrissy, like what you said, again, the guidelines are really bendable, right? And so that's what's really important about this whole process is to remember that if the state comes in or a LIHTC project comes in, their deed restrictions and their guidelines rule. So that's what's really important as we continue to think about these is that really, again, going back to like how are the guidelines applied, when we really truly use the guidelines to their fullest potential, it's really when it's a county or city led or a publicly led local project where we don't really take in a lot of external funding. Sarah, yep.
So we still, again, I'm trying to just make sure that I'm understanding and reiterating, we still, depending on which location is chosen, there's some negotiation with that entity that might own that property. And we are likely not looking, the city and county, the local government are likely not looking at, I have the 40 unit number in my head that this is going to work. So let's operate with that. We're not looking at 40 units at 120. We are looking at just the units that we plan to subsidize, because whatever that negotiation is with the landowner, they will manage those properties. We would manage and decide on what would work. And all of that would be based on what actually the construction costs are going to be. And then what the city and county and perhaps any other partner might have to subsidize to ratchet that cost down to meet that AMI. So we could have, I don't know, I did numbers and I don't think you would use, I don't think I necessarily did the right way, but I averaged like $325 a square foot, building 40 units at 1,500 square feet each. That's like $487,500 at cost. And then whatever that profit is on each unit, say $100,000, that might be way high. I don't know, or call it contingency. So you've got 590,000-ish, but somebody who makes 120 AMI, and I don't remember what was on your list, can only afford a $250,000 house. So in theory, if we were talking about all 40 units, we'd have to subsidize $250,000 on 40 units, which is a significant amount. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me back you up a little bit. So what I have found in practice in doing actual development projects where the subsidy, the local government subsidy normally comes in on projects I've seen it as little as $20,000 a unit, but normally it's in the $40,000 to $80,000 a unit. And those $80,000 units are normally the 120 and lowers, and the 40,000 is that. Now with construction costs continuing to increase, like that was a year and a half ago number on the last project I did. It's like this. But and those subsidies come in all different kinds of forms, right? Those subsidies come in the form of a land donation, tap fee waivers, building permit waivers, things like of that capacity that help buy down what I always term broccoli costs when we talk. So that is when we start putting together a pro forma, that's really what we pay attention to is how do we get as much of the broccoli out and only try to pass on vertical construction costs to the end user. And then there's other programs that the state offers or like LIHTC that come in with significant gap funding. That's actually that gap I just talked about. And when those funds come into play, that's really when you start to see the AMIs being dictated by outsiders coming into the project. That makes sense. Great question. Other questions?
Michael, this is Greg. I noticed in tier 3 that it just said, and I don't have it in front of me, or maybe it's on page 2 there, but it's what it said was would be people living in Lake County and working outside of Lake County under 200% AMI. Do we care if we get to tier 3 how long they've been living in Lake County?
You know, this was suggested today from one of your council members. These other two on the right. I think that's a great question for the electeds to decide. You know, this is like the stickiest, toughest decision, and then you know we spend a lot of time on it, and then all of a sudden we realize, like a project like Sarah just talked about, we come in and we have all these performance and we adjust the tiers for that particular project anyways. But what I think is important about this, Greg, is really this serves as kind of the model. So if I'm a private developer coming in to your community and I say, hey, I'm doing a 20 unit project and let's say in the near future, the city adopts a policy that allows, and the county adopts a policy that allows additional density if you provide affordable housing units. If they say, hey, if I can do 3 extra or 4 extra units, I'll provide 4 affordable units. They're going to go to these tiers and they're going to say, oh, I'm going to provide 2 tier 2 units and 2 tier 3 units potentially. These serve again as guidelines, right, for somebody that's coming into your community to understand where your priorities are on who you want to see in housing, and gives them the ability to come to to you in an annexation process or in a development process to potentially negotiate. Does that make sense? You're on mute if you're trying to respond.
Okay, yes.
Okay. iPhone, you got your hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. This is Dana Green. I forgot to change my name.
No
I
problem.
just want a clarification that with things like this, with deed restriction and the tiers, that this is something that is per project. Like if we had a different development at a different parcel, could we apply different deed restrictions? Let's say if we got into this first one and we're like, wow, like we're behind the 8 ball and we really need to prioritize residents first, could we change up the deed restriction tiers for a different project?
So I think the short answer is yes, but there's a key term that you're throwing in there that is not changeable. When you say deed restriction, there's a difference between guidelines and deed restrictions. When you sell a unit, the deed restriction that is placed on that property is not movable, i.e. it's in perpetuity. To change it, really the only way to change it, because most people will have a lien holder consent on that deed restriction, the only way that actually is changeable is that you would actually have to go through the the body that placed the deed restriction, and more tenuous is actually getting the lien holder to sign off on any changes that were originally placed on the mortgage that house was built. So the deed restriction, once placed on the property, is there. However, in the guidelines to what I think is what you're technically asking, for instance, from project to project, yes, the guidelines are flexible. These tiers could be moved and modified. And in most cases, they are often, before the units come up, there's actually a sheet that is, here are the tiers for this particular project, and here's who qualifies, and here's the lottery procedures. Again, always going back to the guidelines as the best practice for a majority of those decisions, if that makes sense.
Thank you. That answers my question completely.
Okay. Awesome. Those are great questions. Anything else? Sorry, and I can't see a hand raised because I don't have my full screen unless I do it that way.
Hey, Michael, I've got just a few comments to make.
Sure.
So this whole idea of the home buyer education class, first of all, any low-income buyer or any buyer that's going to be even 100 or 120% AMI that's going to be benefiting from some sort of a grant is going to be required to take a HUD certified home buyer education class. So it can't be a class that you teach or that Jackie teaches or that Claudia teaches. It has to be a CHFA certified class. So I just wanted to make that clear. If lower income folks are going to be required to take this class, I think everybody should be required to take the class. And therefore, no extra points for it. Just say, if you're benefiting from these programs, the expectation is you take a class before closing. No big deal, but no points. That doesn't make sense to me.
That's fair. That's a fair comment. What I will say is that one of the things, and I hate to throw this at Jackie, one of the things of having a housing director is to get Jackie to be a certified HUD instructor. And so we'll add that to her ever-growing list of things to do, so that we have somebody in Lake County. Not that she has to accomplish that in the next 6 days. So Jackie, don't go signing up to do that tomorrow, please. But in the long run, having a local person in the community that's able to offer those classes. Rita, I think what your point is it's perfectly legit. I think you could actually write, if you're going to go that direction, what I would do is exactly what you said, is that prior to any lottery, folks are required to take the class. All I will say is I'm a big proponent of it. I think I told the story. I took a class. I decided not to sign a mortgage. It wasn't even for a lottery. It was just for one of those subsidized programs. And you're absolutely right. This is the biggest financial decision that most of these folks have made in their entire life. So having that additional day of knowing what they're getting themselves into is really important. So I agree with you. The question would be, do we write that in that the class is mandatory?
So I would advocate for being mandatory, but before closing, not before lottery, because that might inhibit some people from participating in the lottery because they can't get in a class in time. So just before closing, that's the expectation. Everyone takes it. So
Love
just
it.
wanted to put that one out there. So in the last meeting, it felt like we kind of pushed through the 2% or 3% pretty hard without much consideration. I'm assuming part of that is the timing of this particular process, that we need to land on something and move on, and that this can be revisited later. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that 2% or 3% appreciation, again, is a guideline, right? And certainly at the time of the execution of a project, that can be adjusted as part of the negotiation. That appreciation cap is actually baked into the deed restriction and lives in perpetuity, as you probably know. Yeah, I think you're right. It is timing. I mean, a lot of what we're discussing, you know, these types of decisions could take a year, and it is in the idea of trying to get through this. So you're right, it is being done expeditiously.
And so where I'm going with that is there is an opportunity to revisit that by the board that will be making decisions in the future. Ultimately,
Absolutely, and yeah. Yep.
Okay. Great, because there's a lot of more discussion. That particular item merits a lot more discussion so that everyone understands the consequences unintended of different choices. So
I agree. And I also think, just keep in mind that that percentage where it really matters is when the project is completed and the deed restriction is recorded at, at the time of closing. So once, that's when it lives forever, right? And that's where it impacts the buyer in perpetuity.
Great. Well, then as long as there is room for a future discussion there, that's an important one. On the permanent, I'm sorry, the capital improvements, permitted capital improvements, that seems like a really short list. I understand the brevity that's helpful in most situations, but if someone's increasing the value of their unit, let's say going from carpeting to hardwood flooring, that should be considered as a possible, that's increasing the value of their unit. And so that should be captured somehow. We want people to upgrade their units and improve them to increase what they can get out of them. So again, something that this is a really, really brief, simple list. I think it merits revisiting at some point. The question is, who decides when something is permitted or not? Is that again that board?
No, it's the housing director, and then if they disagree with the housing director, they can file a grievance. What I will tell you, Reed, and you and I will disagree a little bit today. I personally think that someone putting in $20,000 in hardwood floors and ripping out carpet is a serious consideration to long-term affordability. And so there's again, you ask 6 housing directors and you're going to get 3 different answers on who and what they agree on. I lean towards protecting affordability. And I guess that's probably baked into me a little bit more because the unit costs that I was building at already were really high, right? So in Crested Butte, when this list originates from, and this actually originates from the Gunnison Valley list that Jennifer Commode helped put together. What I would tell you, Reed, is that when I'm building at a $350,000 unit and selling that, it gives me a lot of heartburn to have someone come in and put $20,000 in flooring in, or an improvement like that, because they have drastically increased decreased who can afford it in the long run. But again, those are decisions that I think we can talk to neighboring communities. I'm not wed to this in any way. This is a starting point. You're right.
Okay, great. Can you go to the slide where you showed all the AMIs and whatnot per household size?
Sure. And this is 2021 to 2022. I haven't seen yet, by the way, just for what it's worth.
Yeah, it hasn't come out yet. So I just wanted to point out something that's very specific to this. Jennifer Commode created this over in Gunnison Valley Regional Housing Authority, and it's been passed around quite a bit. But there's a really important thing to note here. If you look at line 40, maximum sale price divide by 0.90 to get 90% loan to value. The assumption here is that the buyer is bringing 10% of the sales price of the home to closing, which if you're up at 120% AMI, maybe that's feasible. When you're down at 80% AMI, is really unlikely. In fact, 90% of our buyers are able to bring in 1%. 10% of our buyers are not even able to bring that in. And it all comes down to the moment of closing and if they had an expense. So that 10% could really, this could be the mortgage amount plus the 10% that they're going to put in. That would be your sales price. But if you're looking at the 80% AMI folks, well, none of them are going to get to closing because they won't have 10%. So I would like to see that modified to consider the impacts on the lower ends and what the expectation is of what they bring to the table.
Yeah, I love that comment, Reed. That is very true about this table.
Great. Those are, and then I guess my last question then is you've been talking about a future board. We do have a current housing authority in Lake County. Are you saying that is not going to be the future housing authority, or that there's going to be a different entity created? Just what are you referring to there?
So yeah, that's a great question. So that is actually there has been no decision made on that. Actually, the biggest issue that any new board in their bylaws, and it's actually not it's something that we are going out to legal counsel to get their buy-in on an interpretation. One of the biggest issues we have in Lake County and the city of Leadville, because Leadville is still a statutory town, is that it requires a vote to dispose of property, right? The key here is when we leverage public assets, and the big question that we're going to be talking about when we have this upcoming meeting is what kind of oversight does the local government want in a board where they are putting up public property and allowing potentially that board to go out and solicit development on, right? And whether the existing regional housing authority that is the housing authority that exists today, which is just to manage property, is the right mechanism, or creating a whole new one, is a major decision to be made by the legal counsel and interpretation, and whether or not those bylaws can be adjusted so that we don't get in any sticky widgets around having to go to a vote to develop public assets, if that makes sense. So I think that is really the fundamental thing that I see as the what is going to really shape bylaws, and the decision is really is a legal interpretation of how do we create a mechanism for local governments to utilize public land assets where they don't need to. And I think we're seeing that through the Laurel Board was created, right? They didn't use the Regional Housing Authority for a reason. I don't know what that was, but the reason that board was created was to allow the city to create an entity to hold on to the land asset and dispose of it by sale in the future without having to go to a vote. And so what I'm proposing, and the reason this discussion on the 21st is so critical, is to make sure that the elected bodies have buy-in on a future board where they provide land assets to that could be potentially sold. Does that make sense?
You're saying that board would have the right to dispose of a public asset, and it would not have to go to the vote of the people.
Correct. And Sarah, yeah, you're correct. The county is the city that has to do that. Yep. And honestly, Reed, in my career doing housing, the land assets and who controls the development is the biggest political decision that those boards make. And the other piece of the puzzle too is, if you think about it, it's really hard for a county to develop their property and then also be the judge and jury on a land use application, right? So that by putting that authority into a separate board, you also give some space between the final decision makers and that board, because they're ultimately able to release the RFQ and take it through the entitlement process. Does that make sense too?
Sure.
Okay. Yep, Chrissy.
I just want to make sure I am understanding exactly what you're saying correctly. You're saying that on the 21st, we're going to have this conversation to talk about if the Leadville Housing Authority, Elevated Housing Solutions, became the Regional Housing Authority, what would that look like in restructuring the board? Because there would at least need to be like one county representative and one city representative at minimum put onto that board. I think when we had originally heard from the Housing Authority, they were hoping to just add 2 more seats to their board. But if that was not the path, what's the other option?
Is just to create a whole new board and to create a new nonprofit that would serve as the Regional Housing Authority. So we could start from scratch. And I again, I lean heavily in the DOLA grant for this specific purpose. We built in the budget to have a legal opinion on bylaws. I am not a legal expert in any rights of the, as it relates to this particular issue. And it's important, and that's why we made sure we had funds in the DOLA grant so that we could get the opinion that we needed to make sure that we do this properly, so we don't get into a situation and that we are successful in developing housing into the future. Actually, if you look at the dual qualified strategies, the use of public property is strategy one, right? And so
Yeah.
that's why we're making sure we do this right.
And then I would just mention to elected officials tonight, please reach out to Becky Gray, who has recently just gone through this process. She will tell you that if she had the option to work with the existing housing authority, theirs did not want to work with them. She would have much rather did that because the barriers were much lower in that than recreating a whole new board. So I think, you have willing and able people who want to work with you, but yeah, don't hesitate to utilize our neighbors who are willing to help us, such as Becky Gray. And if you guys need her email address, I can put that in the
We
chat.
we definitely have Becky's stuff, and the only other piece of the puzzle that I will add to the color of the conversation that's coming up is that it's really important for the city and county to say that they want an outside entity developing their property too, right? So that's one of those really, like, I don't want to, I have definitely gotten the indication that we're interested in building housing and getting this thing going, right? But how we actually do that, and I'll throw this out from personal experience. In Crested Butte, in the Gunnison Valley, the town of Crested Butte, when I was the planner, I was adamant that the town was going to develop our own properties because we had really strict guidelines, et cetera, that I wanted to make sure were upheld and weren't going to be politically motivated by outside entities that would try to cut costs by not following the strict adherence of our guidelines. And for us, we made that decision that we were not going to use the housing authority to develop property, but they were going to help us with the administration of the programs, the lotteries, et cetera. So I think that's a really important discussion for the city and county elected officials to have. And I want to make sure that that space is created to have that conversation. I do agree with you, Christy, that if we do move forward, it's going to be great. We've had some already great conversations with the existing. I think you're correct. And they have expressed a willingness to participate. So it's exciting. And again, it's that formal governance structure, it's the real dry stuff that's all part of getting this first House bill. The first one's the hardest. All right, other questions? These are great. I'm glad we were able to make some space and time for these questions. Okay.
Wait, I have another one.
Sure.
Can you walk us through what the process will be going forward from this meeting? I know you already presented to City Council. Sure. Can you be very clear about what's next steps and when decisions are expected and all that jazz?
That's a great question. So there's two more meetings that are based on Regional Housing Authority guidelines. Christy, as you remember, in the guidelines, there was about 100 blanks of who's administering the guidelines, remember? So this was really a chicken and egg decision of, do we do guidelines first or do we do a Regional Housing Authority discussion first? We actually did the guidelines first because of the efforts of the Housing Coalition and getting the draft as far as we did. So it was an easy discussion to start with, so that we did. But once we have a kind of a north arrow on how we want to proceed with the board, or if this is going to be a city county run thing, once that direction is given, then we can then get a draft started to go forward. The third meeting, though, is really critical before the draft actually moves into the public realm, in that we want to make sure that everyone is in agreement on the additional programs and other types of things that the housing authority would do when they're not developing property, right? So energy efficiency programs, first time home buyer classes, which Reed just brought up, loan assistance, down payment assistance, energy rehab. There's a lot. Mobile home park assistance is one that we've seen come out of some requests out of these types of organizations. So that last meeting is really to kind of put a bow around what does the full package look like beyond just developing housing. at that point, we should have community guidelines and bylaws that are kind of wed to each other to bring forward to the elected officials. What we've discussed is taking that first to the county and kind of doing like a U.S. representative Senate kind of process here, where the county is the House of Representatives because they're full time and they're always there. Take it to them, let them make suggestions, send it to the city, have the city weigh in on it, and then have probably a joint hearing to adopt both of those. And the side conversation too, as you brought up, we are also going to have a conversation with the existing regional housing authority and how we can ensure, because they already serve as a function, which is really important, in that they have existing employees and they manage property. And how do we respect that if we do use them? How do we respect that to make sure that their employees aren't put in a position where they feel like they have new bosses and their lives have been turned upside down? So we need to be really respectful of that. So those conversations between the first and second meeting will lead into the third meeting. And hopefully it could come out of the third meeting with kind of a overall consensus that we're all headed in the same direction. There's no major friction on like for instance, like we had in Crested Butte, to be honest with you, and Crested Butte saying, no, we don't want the regional housing authority developing our lands. That was a major political decision that we made, right? So I want to make sure that those decisions have been vetted, and we'll have this ready to go by the end of May. And then at that point, we'll be taking this as well as potential outcomes from the housing charrettes, which are also going to produce potentially land use code recommendations. So that will really start up in June and July and go through the formal processes, and hopefully we'll be in a good space in August and being ready to kind of wrap up our qualified strategies and also have a formal board ready. Does that make sense?
I think so, but let me recap to make sure I'm understanding. So after this meeting, before the April 21st meeting, the BOCC is going to take first crack. No. Okay.
No, we're going to definitely do the 21st meeting first,
Okay.
because the guidelines right now, there's lots of blanks in the guidelines, so that we got to go through the 21st. From the 21st to the 25th meeting, which is the third meeting, what we will be doing is putting together a comprehensive recommendation, and that the 25th, on the 25th, we'll be kind of putting a bow around it in a joint work session. From there, after that point is when we will be taking the different resolutions to establish a regional housing authority and resolutions establishing the community guidelines to the elected officials, and then going through that process.
So in May is after the April 21st meeting. In May is when the BOCC will take first crack at looking at the community guidelines.
No, in May will be the first crack for the entire community to see the drafts.
Okay.
And that will be presented at that May meeting. So
Okay,
I
so
think
you talked about the House of Representatives thing. When are you planning on that?
after the May meeting. After the May meeting.
After the May meeting, so in June.
Yes.
So we're looking at probably having these finished by end of June.
That would be the goal.
Okay.
It's very ambitious, but yes.
Okay. I figured if I had questions about it, other people might.
No, that's
so
fine.
It doesn't hurt
Great
to go ahead
questions.
and just be really explicit.
Yep. Those are great questions. There's a lot that, the governance structure of all of this is, I think, is often overlooked because you guys are surrounded by communities that have been doing this for a long time. And I can sympathize with like wanting to get going, but this is really like, this is the framework. This is and I've always said it, like the first house is going to be real tough, but then after that, everything's in place. Great questions. We certainly can. Oh, Jackie, yes. And Jackie, hopefully you got those charrette dates pulled up too.
Yes, I loaded the flyer that was sent out from the SE group, so you can check that. The dates are April 14th. There's going to be 2 sessions, one from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. that will be held at City Hall. And then the second one will be from 3 to 6 p.m. and that's going to be at the elementary school library. And then I just wanted to say that the strategies date that we had put on the calendar was May 19th.
Thank you.
Yep, the next meeting with the SE group, they had reserved that May 25th date for the next charrette. So that's all.
Yes, thank you for correcting me. I have a lot of dates in my mind right now, so thank you. So May
Okay.
19th, Christy, is the third meeting when we put a bow on it.
And we haven't set on a venue yet. We don't know where that's going to be, but it's going to be from 6 to 8 p.m. CMC was not available for that date.
Okay. We will work on having a venue established for that at the 21st so we can let everyone know. Awesome. Great questions tonight. I appreciate it. Obviously, I've gotten some emails that have helped inform some of these additional edits. So please keep them coming. We want this to be a community document. I love that the comments we got were centered around equity that helped adjust some of these tiers that we're proposing. Again, these are your guidelines. These are not my guidelines. So I really appreciate all the input and how we structure this. Again, it's going to be something that is a legacy project, so that it's going to help. So with that, I'm going to sign off for tonight and thank everyone again. And let me know if you have questions.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.